je t'aime, si je t'aime, prends garde à toi. Si tu ne m'aimes pas, si tu ne m'aimes pas, je t'aime. Mais si je t'aime, si je t'aime, prends garde à toi.
All right. Let's get started. All right. So what we're going to be talking about today is something called the crowding out effect. It's an economic theory. There are some economic theories that are, work, some that don't. This one's a little bit controversial, but nevertheless, it has been on the test before, so I'm going to go over it. It's been on the test actually a lot, so I'm going to go over it. So the crowding out effect, there's a long explanation and a shorter explanation with graphing. I'm going to go over both. Hopefully can do that in 15 minutes. So the first explanation has to do, and again, worked on Wall Street. So if you think about, first of all, you have to know what a bond is. All right. A bond is basically a promissory note. If you give an issuer of a bond some money, you give them $1,000. What a bond is basically is they agree to take your $1,000, use it for what they want, and they will pay you interest, because remember, that's the price of money is interest. So that issuer, whether it's a municipality, a company, or the federal government, all right? So they issue a bond, which means they need money. You give them your money, your $1,000, and they say, thank you for the $1,000. Here's interest. Here's every month, every year, semi-annual, quarterly, whatever the bond issues, the coupon clips. So they will give you money every year, whatever percent they're issuing. And then at the end of those, let's say it's a 10-year bond, they have different maturities. At the end of that 10 years, you collected your interest and you get your $1,000 back. So it's basically you're loaning that company, that municipality, that federal entity, you're loaning them money and they are paying you for the privilege of using your money. All right, so now that you know what a bond is, all right, you have to know how it relates to the crowding out effect. So effectively, what happens is there's a risk-reward premium for any investment out there. All right, so what risk reward means is the more risky that investment is, the more you have to be remunerated for it. So like if you're taking a big risk, you should get a commensurate return. You should get a higher return than taking a little risk. Savings accounts don't give you very much in return because you're not taking a huge risk. You're just putting the money safe there. If it's a large stock, you might get a pretty good return because you are taking a big risk. You're investing in one specific company. If it's a penny stock, you might get a lot of return back for your money. All right, so there's a whole spectrum of risk reward premium. There's things that aren't very risky, which don't give you very much back, all the way to the most risky investments, which should return you more money. And where you sit in there is your risk tolerance. That having been said, there's a pool of money, right, that people are willing and able to invest in bonds, all right? Ground zero for risk reward, safest possible investment in the bond community is U.S. government federal bonds, because the U.S. government has always and will always hopefully pay back its debts. So when the government spends more money than it has, right, fiscal policy, it receives $1 trillion in taxes, it spends $2 trillion. They have to make that up because they're spending, just like if you spend more than you have to borrow that money. So if the government spends more money than it has to make up that deficit. The way you make up a deficit is by borrowing. So the government borrows by issuing bonds. The more bonds that government issues, especially the U.S. federal government, remember, that's the safest possible investment. So that's the most attractive investment out there for potential investors. All right. So if that government, the federal government, is spending more money than it has and it's issuing a whole ton of bonds, it's going to absorb all of that liquidity. It's going to absorb all of that investment money. All right. And then if you're a company or if you're a municipality and you have to compete with the federal government, you can't go toe to toe with their bonds because you're not as attractive. So what you're going to have to do to try to attract investors to your bond is to up your interest rate to give that investor more return, which, all right, well, Miami bonds are giving me 5%. US government bonds are only giving me 1%, so I'll invest in Miami bonds now that they upped their interest rate. So, theoretically, that's the crowding out effect, is that when the government issues more and more bonds out there, it's the big guy. It crowds out all other investors. Picture it like an offensive lineman pushing people out of the way. So if the big federal government boxes out everyone from getting that money, then they have to do something to attract them. And what they're going to have to do is raise interest rates. All right, so that's in theoretically the crowding out effect. Now, it has a lot to do with fiscal policy. Let me see if I can graph this over here. All right, so if we have, all right, so over here, when we have our handy dandy, and this is how Khan, I think, had a really good video on this. I'll see if I can link it. So the crowding out effect with regard to fiscal policy is this, and he had a bar graph type illustration. So remember, fiscal policy is taxing and spending. This all has to do with fiscal policy, not monetary policy. All right. Now, fiscal policy, let's say government spending, he had it like a bar graph. Let's say government spending is G. Remember that government spending is G. And let's say you get taxes, all right? And let's say taxes are T, tax revenue, all right? Picture that they're straight lines, all right? So these two are equal right now. We are in a balanced budget. Picture that. In fantasy world, we're in a balanced budget. All right, so what will happen is if the government needs to expand the economy, fiscal policy dictates that what they're going to do is increase government spending and decrease taxes. So if the government increases government spending and decreases taxes, our balanced budget is not balanced anymore. So what it's going to have to do is this. That's increased government spending. And you see how now we're spending more than we're taking in taxes, but then we have to cut taxes. Your taxes are way too high. You got to cut it. All right. Hip hop fans, you know what I'm talking about. So I cut the taxes. So I'm losing all of this revenue here. And over on the other side, I'm spending all this more money. So this area right here, I'm going to color it something else. This area here, that wasn't a very good choice of color. Let's color it something different. This area here that I now created, this whole big area here, is now a deficit. So that's a deficit. A deficit, a fiscal policy deficit, is in any one given year if you're spending more than you take in taxes. That's a deficit with a T. Deficit. If you have a fiscal surplus, it means the opposite. It means you collect more in taxes than you're spending, right? But in this case, crowding out effect has to do with a fiscal deficit. So we have a fiscal deficit. So how do we fix a deficit? The government has to borrow more money. So expansionary fiscal policies, what expansionary fiscal policies lead to is increased deficits, let's do a big arrow, increased deficit, and increased deficit lead to more borrowing. Okay, now on a graph which we really haven't shown you yet, but I might as well introduce it here, there's a loanable funds graph. All right, there's two ways to illustrate this. I'm going to show you both, hopefully. There's two ways to show this. The loanable funds graph is basically bank money. You take loans out from the bank. So we have quantity of loanable funds, and it's a normal supply and demand graph. It's a supply of loanable funds. Those are savers. Think S supply, S savers. Those are people saving money in the bank. Who saves money in the bank? People have bank accounts, C. Businesses have bank accounts, I. And government has bank accounts, G. They all three have bank accounts. So those are my savers. Then we have demand for loanable funds. People who demand money from banks are borrowers. So the people who demand money for banks, borrowers, S savers, D borrowers. And we have an equilibrium point, so we connect that quantity of loanable funds, and this is my interest rate. That's why it's such an important graph. And instead of nominal interest rate, instead of nominal interest rate, this is going to be, if I can fit it on here, real interest rate. I told you not to abbreviate. I'm going to break my own rule. So what happens with the crowding out effect? We went back here and we said, all of a sudden, if this goes back, all of a sudden the government's borrowing more. Last year we had a balanced budget. Now we have a deficit. So because the government engaged in expansionary fiscal activities, it created a deficit. Trying to fix the economy, it created a deficit. Deficit yields more borrowing. We went over that. More borrowing, remember that the demand curve represents borrowers. So more borrowers would look like that. You increase the demand for loanable funds because now you have more people borrowing. You have all the existing borrowers, plus all of a sudden big government comes in and it's borrowing more money than last year. And what that does is raises interest rates, all right? That's not intentional. That's the other thing about the crowding out effect that you have to understand. The only entity within the United States that can intentionally raise interest rates is the Federal Reserve. They do it on purpose. They increase the money supply and lower interest rates, or they decrease the money supply and increase interest rates. The government is doing this by accident. They're trying to help the economy. They wind up borrowing more, and more borrowing does that and unintentionally raises the interest rates. The other thing you could say is they're saving less. So you remember we went back here, okay? Tax revenue goes down, so they have less money in their accounts. So the government is depositing less tax revenue, they're saving less. Either way, interest rate goes up. By the way, that's both acceptable on the test. If they ask you to illustrate the crowding out effect, which is usually what they do when they're doing loanable funds graph, it has to do with fiscal policy. It has to do, and they will accept both of those answers to illustrate the crowding out effect. The easier one is the one I went over first, the demand. If they have you do crowding out effect on the money market, which we already went over, this is quantity of money, and this is, don't abbreviate, nominal interest rate. I just can't write right now. So money supply, money demand, and quantity. And we have an equilibrium point, so we connect it. And we have nominal interest rate in a percent. So what happens is this. If we go back here, both of these effects, increase government spending and decrease taxes, if you go into fiscal policy and increase government spending, what that does is that is part of the aggregate demand formula, right? So it increases aggregate demand. And if aggregate demand increases, GDP increases. If you cut taxes, that gives people more disposable income. If people have more disposable income, they will spend more. C will increase. If C increases, aggregate demand increases. If aggregate demand increases, GDP increases. That's your explain. All right, so now if we go back here, remember that money demand, one of the components of money demand is transactions demand for money. Remember, that varies directly with GDP. So if by cutting taxes or by increasing government spending, government increases GDP, people need more money, they're starting to spend more money, they're demanding more money. And what will happen is this: money demand will increase. All right. And if money demand increases, interest rates, again, by accident, not on purpose, interest rates go up. And as we know, as you should know, high interest rates are bad for economic growth. So it's an anti-Keynesian theory. It's put out by the classical people. Look, you interfered in the economy, you tried to make things right with your intervening, and this is, remember, Keynes wanted government spending. So, all right, you guys tried to fix things, and you did, and you fixed GDP, but now look what you did. You raised interest rates, which is going against what you were trying to do in the first place. So you essentially take 2 steps forward and unintentionally take 1 step back. It's controversial because it doesn't always happen. It didn't happen in 2008. We'll see if it happens in this current crisis, but it's not a sure thing. But on the test, if you ever see government spends more money or government taxes less, what will happen to interest rates? You are to say officially interest rates go up. That's the answer that the test is looking for. So that's what. Now, there's also a crowding in effect, which is take everything I said and just reverse it. All right, crowding in effect, if government saves more, taxes more, and spends less and goes towards a surplus, it will borrow less. If it borrows less, interest rates come down. All right, so that's it. That's the crowding out effect. I'll stop sharing. That's the crowding out effect. Hopefully that helps, and I'll put out some more videos, more content. Krause University, let's go.